Okay, so in this last video going through arrays, I want to finish up by talking about the ArrayList class. So before I get into the ArrayList class itself, I first want to take a moment to talk about arrays one last time, specifically to discuss a particular limitation on arrays and why it is that we might prefer to use the ArrayList class instead to overcome this limitation. So whenever you create an array, you're going to construct some kind of array object, whether that's through using the new keyword and the that specialized array constructor, or by simply initializing the array with some specified values between those curly braces. In either case, whenever you create the array, say in this case we create an array with a size of 4, say something kind of like this. Whenever we add items to the array, we can add up to 4 items, but if we run into a case where we might want to add more items to this array, we can't do that unless we completely remake it into a new array with, say, a size of 5. And if we do this again where we want to add yet another item to it, again we would have to remake the array with a size of 6, so forth and so on. So the issue with the array, the major limitation of it, is the fact that we are always going to be restricted to however many items we specify or whatever size we specify when we first create it, whether that's through the constructor or by initializing it with some values. So ideally what we want to use instead is some kind of listing or a collection of items that can either grow or shrink depending on the number of items that we put into it. And this is where the ArrayList class comes in. So whenever we add an item or remove an item from this array list, the overall size of it, so the total number of items that we can put into it, will grow and shrink to accommodate for that. So we don't have to constantly reconstruct it. Instead, it will constantly grow and shrink, essentially on demand for us. All right. So now that we understand that much, now we're going to go ahead and start creating our own array lists, and then also using a couple of methods with them. So we're going to go ahead and make a new project or a new program here. I'm going to call this ArrayList Demo.java. So I'll have our public class ArrayList Demo. We'll give this a main method, so public static void main. I'll have our string of arguments. And inside of here, the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is create my array list. So I'm going to go ahead and declare one, and then also go ahead and construct the object, so essentially calling the class. So to do this, we're going to need the array list. We then need a pair of angular brackets, and this pair of angular brackets is necessary to specify the type. So in much the same way as when we work with our arrays, we had to specify the type for the individual items in that array, we also have to do the same thing for the array list. But there is one particular catch with the array list, which is that we can no longer use primitive data types for the types of the items. So instead, we have to specify the class that is associated with that primitive data type. So to give you an example of this, we were working with int arrays throughout most of the examples that we've seen up to this point. So if I want to do the same thing with an array list, instead of doing int for the data type for it, for the primitive data type, I need to instead specify the integer class. Okay? And then the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is create a variable name for this. So a pretty useful convention is to just use the name of the kinds of items you're going to put into it, and then the word list. So in this case, I'm going to call this my number list. This is then going to be equal to a new array list. Again, we want to specify the type for the individual items, and then we also need that pair of parentheses for the constructor. And if you're doing this through an IDE, like say NetBeans or Eclipse, if you've done just this much so far, you're probably already noticing a bit of an issue with this, which is that your program is probably complaining about the fact that it doesn't really know what ArrayList is. And the reason for that is that ArrayList is actually a class that we have to import. So this is not something that's provided by default, like say our specialized arrays. Instead, we're going to include an import statement here. So we're going to get this from the util package. So we'll do java.util.ArrayList. Okay. So this will give us access to the ArrayList class, and then all of the methods and say any fields that come with it. Okay. The next thing I want to go ahead and do is start adding some items to this. And in order to add items to an array list, we actually have to use one of the methods that comes with it. So we're going to do our number list, and we have that dot notation, and then we're going to use the add method. And this allows us to add an item essentially at the end of the array list. So as we step through this, say we want to put an item into it at first. The first time we do add, we're going to put something at the 0th position of the array list. The next time we do add, we'll put it at the first position. The next time is at the second position. Next time after that is at the third position, and so forth and so on. Okay, so for this particular one, I'm just going to do probably multiples of 5. Will be an easy thing to keep track of. So we'll just add 5 at the first or the 0th location. We'll do 10 at the first location, and then 15 at the second location. Okay. The next method we'll go ahead and take a look at is if we want to be able to access one of these items, then what we want to make use out of is getting our number list, our dot notation. We're going to use the get method. And for this get method, what we need to specify here is going to be the position inside of this array list where we want to access this item from. So let's say we want to access this 10 right here. That's at position 1. Go ahead and save that, and then we'll go ahead and run this, adding these 3 items, and then printing out the number 10 to the console. So we're going to compile our ArrayList demo.java, and then run this ArrayList demo, and we print out the number 10 to the console. Okay, so this is the add and the get method. In addition to these 2 methods, there are 3 other methods that I also want to talk about, which are going to be the remove, set, and size methods. So we'll go through each one of those in order. So we'll go ahead and look at the remove method. So we're going to do number list.remove. And this remove method also is going to take a position inside of the number list. And what it's going to do is it's just going to remove the item at that position in the list, and then anything that came after it is kind of moved up. So to give you an example of this, we have 5, 10, and 15. If I go ahead and remove this 5 at position 0, and then we go ahead and do another print statement, do our number list.get, and we'll go ahead and get the item that's at position 0 now after we've removed this 5. What's going to happen is the 10 and the 15 are going to get moved up, so 10 is going to become the item at position 0, and 15 is going to become the item at position 1. So when I do this right here, this again will also print out the number 10. So we'll go ahead and compile this and run it, and we can now see 10 for both the first and second print statements. Okay. In addition to this, we also have the set method. And so with the set method, what this is going to do is we have to specify 2 things. So we'll grab our number list.set. The first thing that we're going to specify is a position in the array. So let's say we want to specify position 1, which after doing this remove right here, position 1 has the value 15 in it. So I'm going to go ahead and specify that. And then the second thing, the second argument that I need to put into the set method is going to be the value that I want to change this to. So say maybe I want to change this 15 to the value 20. And so then we can go ahead and access that. So do a system.out.println, do our number list.get, and we'll go ahead and get the item that is at position 1. So at this point after the set, that should be the value 20. So we'll compile that, run it, and now we see for this last print statement we get the value 20. Alright. So I'm going to go ahead and comment all of this out so that now we can take a look at one last method for this, which is going to be the size method. So for the size method, the way that I'm going to demonstrate this is in a very similar fashion to whenever we work with the length method or the length field for arrays, where we want to specify a for loop. So we're going to say something like for integer index equal to 0, as long as this index is now less than our number list dot size. So size is going to be a method that gives us the number of elements that are currently inside of our array list, and then we'll do index plus plus. And then right here, what we can go ahead and do is just do system.out.println. And if we want to access the items at every single one of these positions, we're just going to do the name of the array list, so number list dot get, and then we'll just put that index right here. Okay, so this is basically the equivalent of specifying a particular subscript or a particular position inside of a normal array. We're just going to use get and then the index that's being incremented through this for loop. So go ahead and compile this and run this and just print out the values 5, 10, and 15, each on their own individual lines. You can see that right here, this 5, 10, and 15. In addition to being able to use a traditional for loop, we can also make use out of the enhanced for loop with an array list. So for this one, we're going to do an int, we'll call it number. This is going to be from the number list. And then right here, we're just going to say system.out.println and do number. So this will just take, basically, it's going to do the same thing as what we did for this traditional for loop right here, but we're just doing it in a much more concise and also a much more secure way. So we'll go ahead and clear this, make some room, we'll compile it, oops, run it, and we can still see that we get the values 5, 10, and 15 printing out. Okay, so in addition to everything that we have right here, there's one other property of an array list that is unique to this compared to normal arrays, and that's going to be what is known as the capacity. So the capacity is another value that we can specify when we first construct it. Say maybe I want to put the value 100 right here. And so what this is going to do is it's going to specify the size, the overall size for the array list at that particular moment. And obviously you might be thinking already, well, why do we need to specify this overall size when the intent of using an array list is that it can grow and shrink as needed to accommodate for how many items we put in. And essentially, I'm just going to say now, while this is to some degree a useful concept or property of array lists to be aware of, in the vast majority of practical cases, this value, you'll never really need to concern yourself with the capacity of an array list. In fact, in most cases, whenever you specify this value, there's a pretty good chance that once you start adding or removing something from it, that this value will automatically be updated to match with those additions and removals. So it's admittedly very difficult to actually control for the capacity, and in the vast majority of cases, you don't really need to worry too much about this. Okay. So we'll go ahead and remove that. Won't worry too much about that. The next thing we'll go ahead and talk about to start kind of wrapping up on this is addressing both string array lists as well as object array lists. So for this next part, what we'll go ahead and do is create an array list of strings. So we're going to have an array list, and the data type for the individual items will be string. So we're going to specify that in those little angular brackets. We'll call this one name list. This will be equal to a new array list, which takes strings. We'll then have that pair of parentheses to call the constructor for this array list. And then for this one, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just add one item for this. So we're going to do name list.add. So we'll add one name. Let's do David for this. And then what I want to go ahead and do is just demonstrate the ability to get that particular string, and then also show, just like with the with our regular arrays, that we can also go ahead and call methods using the individual items inside of this array list. So we'll do a print statement. We're going to go ahead and do name list.get, and we want to get the item that is at position 0, since this is the only thing that we've put into this array list. We'll go ahead and compile this and run it, and we can see our 5, 10, and 15 from the previous example, plus the string David at the very end here. And then, of course, in addition to being able to do this namelist.get0, we can then add another dot to this. So this whole portion right here is going to give us the string David, and then we can apply one of these string methods to that string David. So let's say we want to do the toUpperCase method. So go ahead and save that. It'll give us David, and then it will just capitalize every letter in the name. So compile this and run it, and now we have David in all caps. Okay. The last thing we'll go ahead and take a look at, we'll go ahead and create a second class. So this is going to be an additional program or additional file for your program or project. And for this one, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just create a little bit of the code for the rectangle class. Yeah, that's right. I already have this one from when we demonstrated it before. Okay, good. So we have the rectangle class from when I demonstrated it for object arrays. So now we're going to look at an array list of objects besides something like a string. So this is going to be an array list of custom objects. So we're going to create an array list. We'll have our angular brackets, and inside of these we're going to specify this class, rectangle. And for this one, I'll call this the rect list. Say this is equal to a new array list. Now type rectangle. Close that off. And then what I can go ahead and do is just add a rectangle to this. So we'll do rect list.add, and I'm going to add into this a new rectangle object. So I'm not going to worry about the part where I would create a reference variable for this. Instead, I'm just going to concern myself with the object construction. So we'll do new rectangle, and then we can also specify some dimensions for this. So if we look back at our rectangle class, we see that we still have, oh yeah, that's right. For this one, we set it up so that it only had a no-args constructor. That's fine. We'll go ahead and just do it like this and demonstrate a couple of additional methods. So we'll do our new rectangle, and then we'll go ahead and do two things. So we'll go ahead and get it so that we can set one of the two fields for it, and then we'll do another print statement and get it again so we can actually print out the field that we changed. So we're going to do a rect list.get. Again, we're going to get the item at position 0 since this is the only rectangle that we have in there. Currently, this rectangle object that we constructed, if we look at this constructor, it has a length of 1 and a width of 1. So let's go ahead and just set the length. So we've got our rectangle object by doing this little part right here, and we can then go ahead and apply one of those rectangle methods to it. So we're going to do set length, and then we'll go ahead and set the length to something like, let's say 7.5. So we'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll also go ahead and do a print statement. And in this print statement, we will again go ahead and get the item at position 0 of our rectangle list. And then we can go ahead and do the getLength method to return this 7.5 and print that to the console. All right, so we'll go ahead and save this. We'll run it, and we'll see that 7.5 at the end. Go ahead and clear this, compile it. Oh, I left off the new keyword. Okay. So go ahead and make sure that we keep the entire line the way that it's supposed to be. Then we'll go ahead and compile this and run it. Run that, and then we can see the 7.5 at the very end here. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to go ahead and talk about to wrap up on this. So we're seeing this case where we want to specify the array list. So we're going to create an array list object, and we specify the data type that we're going to be using for the individual items of that array list. And then when we come over to the constructor, we're basically doing the exact same thing right here. So ideally, we want to come up with a slightly more concise way to do this. So what we can actually do, whenever we create our array list, let's say for this last example, I'm going to create an array list that consists of doubles. Again, I want to make sure that I'm not specifying the primitive data type, but instead I'm specifying the class type. So it's going to be double. And then I can go ahead and create my variable name. So we're going to say something like a decimal list. This will be equal to a new array list. And then right here, instead of putting the data type again, I'm just going to use what is known as the diamond operator. So it's just going to be the two angular brackets next to each other like this, and then I have my constructor and my pair of parentheses to indicate that I'm calling the constructor, and this is all that I need. And the reason that I can do this is because of the fact that whenever I create my reference variable, so when I've declared this decimal list right here, I've already specified what the data type for the individual items should be. So when I create the object for it, the only thing that could possibly make sense here, at least within this context, is for this to be an array list of doubles. So what Java is going to do when I specify just this diamond operator is it's going to just infer what the type should be for the individual items of this array list. Okay. So at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for the ArrayList class. This is also going to conclude everything on arrays up to this point. Going forward from here, if you're going to keep track of everything for the course that this set of videos is related to, moving forward, we're going to start getting into even more advanced topics related to classes. So moving forward, this is going to get into a lot more depth about object-oriented programming.